Welcome,
Joe, just
everybody. Hello, welcome, everybody. My name is John Cleese, and thank you for joining us today. We are here today to discuss the latest results from our State of the Workplace survey. And we have just a few housekeeping items that we want to talk about before we get started. Please use the chat to ask any questions. And also, I believe in the chat, you'll see that there's a link if you want to ask questions anonymously. Go ahead and put them in there. We'll try to get to them during the presentation. If not, we'll try to leave a little bit of time afterwards. But knowing us, we will definitely try to grab your questions as we're moving along. Following the presentation today, you will receive the executive summary of the findings along with a copy of this presentation. And then at the end of the presentation, there will be a QR code that links to a brief survey. Yes, one more survey for us. Which we hope you'll share your feedback about this webinar. And let's get started. So I want to introduce us today, introduce who's going to be our panelists. Again, my name is John Cleese. I'm a remote workforce consultant here at Achurch, and I'm joined by Maria Negron. And Maria is also a consultant and a strategist here at Achurch. Welcome, Maria. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you that don't already know, Achurch Consulting, we have two divisions. One division is actually dedicated to software implementation for associations. And the division Maria and I both work in is focused on optimizing remote and hybrid workforces. And as part of that work, we will not only conduct extensive interviews and surveys for our clients when we're trying to understand the state of their organizations and create business strategies, but we also conduct surveys and interviews outside of our core clients so we can sort of get a pulse on where businesses are, where organizations are with remote and hybrid work. And in fact, the survey that many of you participated in was exactly that pulse survey. And that's what we're going to talk about today and share some of those results with you. So again, welcome, Maria. Thank you so much for joining us. And can you take us through some of the mechanics of the survey before we get into some of the results?
Sure. So like we do with our clients, we wanted to take a quick pulse of where things stand at this point in the transition that we've been seeing over the last 2 years. So we decided to do just that because we get a lot of questions from leaders, from clients about what other people are doing, what problems they're seeing, how do I compare? So we thought this was a good time to kind of get a sense of where things stand right now, right? This point in 2022, as opposed to where things were at a year ago, we had much more uncertainty and even before that. So we decided to craft a very brief survey. It had 19 questions. Most of them were quantitative. We included one qualitative question in it. And we surveyed leaders, the C-suite, the CEOs and managers, and we will provide we'll provide those different results where they are we'll provide some clarification on different results where we saw them in the data. So we specifically surveyed leaders, and we did so in a very short time frame. We had the survey open for 4 weeks earlier this fall, and we surveyed a combination of for-profits and not-for-profit organizations. And what we really wanted to be able to do was provide data for leaders moving forward. So they had a snapshot, like we put in our title slide earlier, of where things stand right now, so they can think about what decisions they might want to make moving forward. Okay, there's still a lot of work that we can see that organizations need to work through as we continue into this future of work that we're embarking on. One of the things I did want to highlight was that we did have some disconnect between the leadership levels, right? And this was on some areas of remote and hybrid work. And so we're including those breakouts where there's a contrast between opinions, where we thought it was important to highlight so that leaders can then have these internal conversations and see what is happening within their organization. Is this result holding true for us? And if so, what are some of the root causes and how can we get past it?
Interesting. I'm sure I can guess which group maybe has some differences, but we'll find out as we go through the results. So let's talk about the first finding. And again, we've got a lot of findings in this survey, but for the purposes of today, we're basically going to share some of the top 4 with you. And this first one here is that interaction and culture are leaders' top hybrid workforce concerns. And I have to say that probably doesn't surprise me too much. It's what we heard before coming out of the pandemic. But Maria, why don't you take us through some of the numbers here and show it how it broke out?
Right. So like I said, we asked leaders across the board what their top concerns were. We provided a list of about the top 16 concerns that we commonly hear in organizations. And these are ones that we normally include when we are working with our clients. And they span the gamut across what we normally term our 5 elements. So here we had when we just look at the leaders across the board, these were the top 5 results that we found. So most leaders, the majority of leaders were concerned about that spontaneous communication that we can think of in terms of those water cooler moments, that ability to pop next door and have a quick conversation with you, John, because I just need your time for 5 minutes to answer a quick question, which we know doesn't always work out that way. But that's the kind of what lies in that bucket, that spontaneous communication, that you're not setting up a meeting, you're not setting up this whole system to get in touch with each other. Then there is workplace culture and morale. And here I think the concern is a change in it. So perhaps like a fraying, because maybe our culture looks different than it did before. Different doesn't necessarily have to mean bad. It just can mean different, right? We have all changed over the last several years, and our organizations have changed, and what we do and our products and our services might have also changed. So this change could be good or bad, but apparently our leaders overall, this is their second highest concern. Rounding out that top 5 are the onboarding challenges coming in at 47%, decreased employee collaboration coming in at 45%. And then about 20 points lower than that are administrative and operational challenges. So this we hear a lot when we talk to our clients and their staff especially, is that ability to find what you're looking for when you need it. So are we both using the same drive to share our documents? Are we using the same systems to send things to each other so that our work product is aligned and I'm not emailing you a version of something that we're working in, and then I'm working in a different version and the edits aren't captured. So these are the challenges.
Yeah, so a couple of things. What I find interesting in this is the third one, onboarding challenges for new employees, because I know in the work that we've done from clients, I would say, well, almost 100% of the time, people that were onboarded during the pandemic or remotely almost always come in as happier and feel more satisfied with the process than the people that were done in-house or on site. So I find that interesting. That's still a top 3 when we don't necessarily hear that when we interview individuals that have gone through an onboarding process remotely. I think that again could go to the population of people that we surveyed. So leaders might perceive this to be a higher challenge. Maybe it's more challenging for the leaders putting together a more intentional onboarding program, or it's something they've had to scramble to put together. Whereas when we're talking to staff in our interviews and in our survey, we're talking to them directly, and maybe they've had a very pleasant experience because these other groups went through the hoops and really came up with a very intentional way of doing it. But we didn't ask staff in this survey how they felt about those things. But that, to your point, would be a really great area to figure out, are we on the same page? Like, we think it's a challenge, but maybe the people who have come on board think we've done a phenomenal job, and we just need to make sure that we're keeping that process together. Yeah, exactly. So the other thing I find interesting here is what's not on this, which is productivity is not in the top 5 concerns. And I mean, I think we continue to hear about that in the news cycles. We know that was a huge thing coming out of the pandemic. Oh, people work extra hard. They were pulling for the organization when we went through it. And now those gains are going to start to fade away. But according to this, at least in the top 5, that's not even there. In fact, I'm going to ask you, where did productivity come in regards to the top concerns for leadership?
It wasn't even in our top 10. So it came in at number 12, with about 12% of our leaders overall saying that productivity was a concern. And I mean, at 12%, it's a very distant 12th place, because our top concern here is pretty close to 70% of leaders. I mean, that's a very sizable chunk of leaders are very concerned about that communication. Another sizable chunk are concerned about culture at 62%, 62.86%, but productivity is coming in at 12%, around from across the leadership. It's a very distant 12. workplace.
Interesting to see that. Well, it's good to see that too, for sure.
One
Now,
other interesting thing that I thought, John, that I'll point out is that people were more likely to be concerned, and this was still pretty distant, about being distracted in the office than being distracted remotely. That again was a really low concern. And that's another one kind of out there with productivity that you hear in the media, that leaders are concerned about people getting distracted at home with all of the things that we have. And again, that's just not coming up and rising to the top for our leaders.
It's funny you say that, because I was in a leadership roundtable the other day, and one of the leaders, and we'll get into this later about sort of team led back in the office, but their days in the office where they bring everybody back in is purely a social day, and they actually write that off as a day that's not going to be productive as compared to what they're seeing at home. So interesting. We continue the discussion about that. So this looks like, so in this slide, we've got similarities and differences among the leaders in terms of the top 5 concerns, right? So we've got CEOs to the left. The middle is senior leadership, which would be director and above, and then, VP and above, and then we have director manager on the right. So what sticks out to you about this breakout of the data?
So again, those top 2 concerns, that lack of in-person spontaneous communication and that change in the workplace culture, that held across our 3 different leadership groups as the top concern. Interesting, when I was looking at how people were structured in terms of their workforce, we asked people if they were remote first or hybrid first or in-person first. When I looked at the result for that as well, each of those groups, whether you were remote first, hybrid, or you were in person, these were the top 2 concerns as well. So the structure of your workplace doesn't seem to change that top concern for leaders, which I think is kind of an interesting finding, because I would have maybe assumed that people who were in person wouldn't be as concerned. And we had a very small pool of people who said they were in person, but it kind of holds true. So we see it here, which I think is interesting. That's something that our leaders have in common. Where we start to see some things change is in that 3, 4, and 5 spot. So I'm going to start with the directors who are on the far right. And I'm going to go back to that point I made about distractions remotely being very distant concern. Well, here we see that distractions in the office, just to what you were saying, are of that top 5 concern for directors, right? They're very concerned about coming into the office and it being a very distracting environment for staff. Right, that's their top 5 concern. We see that's absent in our top level leaders, right? Our CEO and our the rest of our C-suite don't share that in terms of a top 5 concern. The other one that I thought was interesting, and again, kind of a divergent point of view, was our VPs, those senior leaders in the middle, who are the rest of that C-suite, your CFOs, your CHROs, your vice presidents. That top 5 is rounded out by having the fewer opportunities for growth. So they are concerned about, those junior employees or people who want to move up an organization, and that perhaps what we're doing is not going to allow for those opportunities for growth. But that's absent from our directors, and it's absent from our CEOs. And what I think is another important point to point out is that we have decreased collaboration. Remember, on our last chart of overall concerns was in that top 5. Our CEOs here on the left have that as their top third concern, right? It's number 3, comes in at number 3 for them. It also comes in at number 3 for our senior leaders, but our managers aren't at all concerned. It's not in their top 5. It's a little lower than that in terms of that employee collaboration. They're not nearly as concerned as other leaders about employee collaboration, and perhaps a decrease in employee collaboration being present currently. They seem pretty happy with that.
Interesting. That is interesting. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later, but I do think the senior leaders, in terms of the growth, and I know we're going to address that, because that continues to be a concern for people and for younger junior workers, right, that want to be exposed to leadership. And how does that happen in schedules that are basically, for many, seem a bit random in terms of how people come into the office. So interesting. I'm glad you broke that out. All right, so let's look at the next finding that we have. Space design is an area of missed opportunity for organizations to address some of their top concerns. So Maria, I know in this chart, you're going to walk us through a little bit about how we got to understand that, what's behind that statement about them not using maybe some of the tools that they have?
Right. So we started off, we asked a few different questions around space for our leaders. So again, when we conducted our survey, we asked CEOs, we asked the rest of that C-suite, those CHROs, those CFOs, those COOs, and we also asked managers and directors for their opinion about what is happening. And so we asked them, the first question was, what kind of relationship do you have with your offices? Do you own it? Do you lease it? Is it a co-working space, or do you not have any office space? And so after we kind of looked at that, and this chart here represents what people are doing with the office space that we have. So for anyone who owns office space, who leases office space, or has co-working space, this is the pool of respondents we have here on this chart. And so we asked them, what are you planning to do in the next 12 months with that office space? Do you think there's going to be an increase in that footprint, a decrease in that footprint, or are you just going to keep it the same? And what we see is that the majority of people, right, almost 60%, are going to be just keeping things exactly as they are, right? That office space, that footprint is going to stay the same. And what we found is that this trend of not making any change, that held true whether you owned space, whether you leased space, or whether it was a co-working space. And the same thing kind of percentage-wise, when we looked across to our people who are decreasing their office space, that almost third percent, that 32.5%, the same thing held true. Like we saw, this was also made up of people who owned space, leased space, and used a co-working space. So it wasn't skewed in any one particular direction. Like we weren't seeing, oh, people who owned real estate getting rid of it. We didn't see people who were in leases having to only stay with what they have. We see this kind of evenly distributed across those three. But what we see, the trend is that there's not a lot of movement when it comes to what we have in terms of a footprint. And so then that caused us to think about, what are they going to do with the space that they have, right? How are we going to utilize that space moving forward? Are people planning on making any changes? Because one of the things that we know, right, is that design can really impact behaviors. And just like we see people out in the world will have speed bumps or we'll have roundabouts, and that makes us slow down when we're driving, it impacts how we behave. We can do the same thing with our office space. We can encourage certain behaviors. We can disincentivize others by the way that we plan our spaces. And so after figuring out what are people doing in terms of the quantity of space, we then asked what people were doing with the space. And that's on our next slide.
There's our next slide. And I do want to point out for the next slide, it is interesting though to see that almost 33% are actually decreasing the amount of their spaces overall. So while the majority stays the same, I mean, again, I think as we know, cities are struggling with people not returning to downtowns, but look at that number. I mean, 33% are going to shed some space. That's significant. So for this one, so walk us through this. So this is, in terms of responses, this are the people that have space, lease space, what they're actually planning to do with it. And unfortunately, as you said, design can be a big incentive for people coming back into the offices, and it doesn't really look here like people are doing very much, are they?
No. So what we wanted to, our hypothesis was that we were wondering what people were doing with their space and if they were addressing some of those top concerns that they have with the use of space. We hear a lot of leaders say that they want to encourage collaboration, that they want to have spontaneous communication and water cooler moments. We saw those are our top concerns when we looked at leadership's overall top concerns. Number one is spontaneous communication. Number two is that workplace culture. And number four was that collaboration piece. And so what we find here is that people aren't using their space to effectuate the change that they want to see. And they are not designing spaces, they're not making additions or remodeling in a way that would allow for what we've often talked about as collision points, right? Places where people come together, where they can come into contact with each other. And so what we gave people here in this question, we gave them several different options Some of those options encouraged collaboration or collision points and socialization, like a usable outdoor space, the designated collaboration spaces. Those are some options right here on this chart. We also included things like offices with doors, right, as options that people can make these changes to their space. And so when we're looking at only those options that allow for greater collaboration and interaction, we don't see people kind of utilizing their space to achieve that. So we see a gap there in terms of what I want and what I'm concerned about and how I'm using my space. And that's why I say it's a missed opportunity, because in speaking with some designers, office space designers, they say that oftentimes one of the very easy entry points is to use that outdoor space, is to, put in Wi-Fi across your campus or your building, make sure that it's outside, put some, comfy lounge furniture out there, and people will congregate, people will meet. You can have teams meeting outside rather than inside in a conference room. And you might get different results. People feel pretty creative when they're outside. So I think it's just looking at different ways of arranging space and arriving at different solutions and thinking about how you can be intentional with your space so you can get what you want. Yeah, and we know from other surveys and work with clients that, again, the top two reasons people come in together to want to come into the office is to, number one, socialize, and very close on the heels of that is collaboration. So if you're not creating those spaces to do that, I'm getting the sense that they're not necessarily, and we get further into this in a couple of slides, but they're not really designing those spaces for the future of work, the way that people want to work. And I think, when we talk to space designers in our work with clients, we also know that many people are coming to the realization that you're actually competing with people's now somewhat comfortable working environments at home. And they don't want to come back into the office just to sit in a cubicle to do the stuff that they know that they can already do better and at least as productive as at home. But, one of the things that I think you've said to clients in the past too, which is one of the things that people are not doing at home is they're not basically hosting their team there. So that is where employers, with a building, with a space, have a real leg up, because you have the ability to bring those people in for a purpose and to have collaborative work times, which is what people are really longing for when they leave their home office, right? If I'm not going to do my focus work at home anymore, I don't want to go to the office to go be, pushed into focus work. I'm going to go to the office because I'm working in a group or a team and we're working on a project. There's a purpose for me to go in there. But again, I think these numbers show that we're lagging yet, even though that's definitely emerging as a real trend in the people that are being more successful in the return to work. And I don't think we have to rely on just conference rooms, which I know, at least in my work experience, has always been where that collaborative work tends to happen, right? Is in a big conference room where you bring people together. We can really think outside the box by creating these collaboration spaces. Maybe if you're in a building with, you own a building with multiple floors, maybe you make a collaboration floor, or a whole segment of if you only have one floor, a whole segment of that floor plan is about collaboration. The other side is dedicated to focus work. You can really distribute the activities that you want to have happen in the workspace throughout it. You just have to think about it and be intentional. Right. And that's just what we're saying here. There's nothing wrong. It's just a missed opportunity that we want to point out for people to take advantage of. Yeah, and I also just add, I know that when we talk to space planners, when people have gone through some wholesale changes of their spaces to make them collaborative and social first, that they always then say they still ended up putting in too many desks. Because once people get used to using these collaborative spaces, most people don't end up going to desks anymore. Because again, that's not the reason that they're coming to the office, right? So interesting. Thank you for pointing that out. All right, so the next finding we have, number 3, organizations could benefit from intentional policy design to encourage team-led collaboration. And I should tell everybody here that's listening, we are very biased in terms of team-led. We really believe in the work that we've been doing with clients that this is the most successful way to get people to interact with your office and bring them together. So Maria, why don't you go ahead and walk us through this chart? I just wanted them to know our bias before you go through that. So yes, when we set up the survey, we asked people right at the very beginning of the survey, we asked the leaders, what type of structure do you have to your workplace? And we asked them to choose among 4 different flavors. One was, are you just primarily in office? right? And only about 3% of the population that responded to our survey were 100% on site. Then our second group, we asked if you were remote first. Almost a third of people said they were remote first. It came out just under 30%. And then our last group, which was our largest respondent pool, was hybrid, but we did offer 2 different flavors of hybrid. The first one was people who are, in office some of the time and at home some of the time. And the second being more of, say, like a retail model where you have some people on site 100% of the time, and you might have some staff who are remote 100% of the time. So when we offered those different flavors, like I said, hybrid was our largest pool of respondents. And so then we asked them very specific hybrid questions. This was one of them. We asked them, how to describe how their hybrid organization is handling the days and time in the office, which I think is one of the most common questions we get asked by clients, is what people are doing, how many days in the office is
what I should we do, right? Yeah.
And so we gave them 5 different options, because this is what we hear most often, are these sorts of choices. So our dark blue, which is our top right corner, those are the respondents who said that they have a specific number of in-office days per week. Say there's 2 required days every week that I've got to be in the office, but I get to choose. So John, you could pick Tuesday, Wednesday, and I would say I'm going in Thursday and Monday, and that is fine. We're both following the policy. The second option here that we gave people, which was the lighter blue, and that is in our bottom right-hand corner. That's where we had people select that their leadership, generally their CEO or executive director, choosing what days of the week all staff are coming together, regardless of what department or team they're on. So that's the CEO saying everyone is in office Tuesday and Thursday, for example. And then our third one is that red slice of the pie in the far left and the bottom left-hand corner. And that's where we have the most flexibility for the individual, where there's no specific number of days that I have to be in the office, no specific day I have to be in the office, and no time requirement. So I can choose to come in Tuesday this week and Wednesday through Friday next week, and no one is going to care. You can come in for 2 hours every single day if you wanted, and then go home, and it would be completely up to the individual. So it's a lot of autonomy and a lot of flexibility. The fourth one we have there is the green, and that's the one where there's a specific number of in-office days per week. So we all know that we've got to be there 2 days a week, but our manager is the one that tells us when those days are going to happen. And then our last one is that tiny slice of a light pink pie at the top. And those are the people who only have a specific percentage of time that they have to be in the office. So maybe it's a 60-40. 60% a month I could be from home and 40 at work.
Right. So it's interesting to me, and the other ones with the more of the mandated specific days, how close they are in terms of their percentages, and then the smaller amount which gets closest to team led. And I know we asked for days of the week, but I think, what we find interesting, again, with a team led where the manager decides or the team decides when they come in, is the fact that they're coming in for a purpose usually. And it really solves the problem of having these soulless, sort of half-empty offices that are not very inspiring for people to work in. It solves the problem of not having access to leadership, because actually at least the leader of your team is in there, and I'll share another example in a moment. It also gives you growth opportunities to learn by other people more senior in your team. And then it also satisfies that socializing and collaboration when your teams are coming into the office. And Maria, I know I shared with you, I was reading in Crane Chicago earlier this week that US Cellular, what actually they do is they require their executive team to come in 6 days a month, and it needs to align with when the teams are bringing their teams into the office, so that everybody gets access to leadership all the way up to the top. But again, teams are only coming in for a purpose, and when a specific team like a marketing team comes in, it is asked that the senior leadership team be on site as well. So they solve all of the problems that we are, a lot of the problems that we're hearing about. Again, no access to leadership, no training, no mentoring, all of that. And so that's, I think, again, why we're very big believers that it should be team led, but unfortunately, when you look at that chart, it looks like a lot of people are just still doing random days. That doesn't help with, like what you said, back to what they wanted in the first place, which is engagement and culture. Doesn't work when we're just all scattered about.
Right. And I think, again, kind of like design was a missed opportunity, here's another missed opportunity. If our leaders are telling us our top concerns are spontaneous communication, culture, and collaboration, how are we designing our policies so that when people are in person and together, we're getting the most from it and people are feeling charged, right? Like, how can we make people feel really positive about that in-office portion? And so we can do that through space, which is what we discussed just before, and we can do it through our policy. So making sure that we're bringing people together when they need to be together. And to your point, I think managers are a really great window into that, because our managers can help coordinate not only our team and what we need to do to and how to accomplish that. They're probably, as we saw with our top concerns, they're not concerned about collaboration. So they're probably pretty dialed in on how people are doing the work. And they're also not concerned about productivity. So they're very dialed into their teams. So here we can really lean on managers to discuss with their teams and have it be a team decision. What days does it make sense for all of us to come together, and also think about and coordinate with perhaps other teams that they work closely with, so that it's also an opportunity to engage with others in the organization. And we're not thinking, oh, you know what, we had our meeting, but marketing wasn't there, and now we all have to come into the office. But maybe we can coordinate across teams to have that cross-functional pollination happening and creating those interactions that our leaders are very concerned about.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I know that I have read of some companies that combine sort of the team led with the percentage. So it still may be that 25% of your time needs to be in the office, but it doesn't matter how, again, it's up to the team to decide based on projects when they're in, but it's kind of a combination of percentage and team led. Very interesting. Thank you for that. All right, let's look at the fourth and our final finding, which is one of the biggest ones, that employee retention and work structure rank as the greatest area of dissatisfaction for leaders. So that we still got a retention issue going on. So why don't you walk us through these numbers, Maria?
Right. So we asked, again, we asked all of our leaders, and our leaders were our CEOs, that CHRO, C-suite, slice, and then our directors. We asked them to give us to rate their satisfaction across these six areas. And so we had them provide that rate of satisfaction. And what I think is really interesting is, as we dig through the data, this is one of those areas where we saw some divergence in terms of what, even though we might say 26% of our leaders are dissatisfied with retention, when we dug deeper, there were differences. And this is where we start to see some of those differences. And we're going to get into that in terms of these slides. But here, what I want to point out first is that employee productivity number, right? People are still really, really high on employee productivity. Very few leaders overall are dissatisfied with that.
It barely registers.
Pardon?
It barely registers. It's like 4%.
It's 4% of our leaders. And that's really great, right? It jives with what we talked about at the very beginning with our first finding in terms of concerns, that employee productivity was a very distant 12th concern for our leaders when they're thinking about the workplace. So this makes sense. It's because they're very happy with the productivity. But you brought up a really great point when we were talking about this earlier, that that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is happy about the employee productivity. So if we ask staff about employee productivity, they might have some different feelings as well about what it takes to get to that productivity. So they might feel like they're doing a great job at being productive, but what we probably want to make sure as leaders that we're doing is ensuring that we are looking at those costs, right? Could the cost of being productive be one of those things that's attributing to that retention number, or could it be costing us engagement? That's something for leaders to look into.
Yeah, productivity is great, but your employees are burnt out. So hard to know on that one. So,
hard to know
but a good thing to look into for sure. So let's look at the numbers here. So here you've broken out by type of leadership. and they're a reflection on the way they feel about retention.
Right. So, like I said, we asked about how are you feeling in terms of employee retention? That was our highest level of dissatisfaction across all of our leaders. Then I looked across those three bands, the CEO, the senior leaders, and our directors and managers. And what I thought was really interesting is that middle level, those senior leaders, our CHROs, our VPs, they're the most dissatisfied. Overall dissatisfaction is highest with that group, coming in at just over 30%. And it's a really big difference from our CEOs, right? We see this really big gap in that dissatisfaction number between that senior leader and our CEOs. So we see that top level really having divergent opinions about the same problem that they're seeing. And then when we go down to our managers, again, they're seeing a problem here. 25% of them feel dissatisfied. That is greater than what our CEOs feel in terms of that, but it's still less than our senior leaders. And perhaps, we have a couple of different thoughts as to why that might be occurring. Perhaps our senior leaders are seeing the effects of it, right? If they're the CHRO or the CFO, they're seeing the costs of it. They're having to put out the word that they're trying to hire. They're having to deal with the real kind of costs of the turnover. Our managers as well could be feeling the very real effects of turnover. Maybe their teams feel more stressed because of having to take on extra work. And so This is an area for leaders to have a conversation about, because clearly they might not be on they're not on the same page.
Or it sounds like, or maybe information is not getting passed up, right? So you've got, right, you only have like 14% of the CEOs are worried about retention, but like you said, you got over 30% of their direct reports. So interesting that they're so worried about it, but yet it's still not a top concern. And maybe it should be, or maybe it shouldn't be, right? Interesting.
Right. And interestingly, when we talked about dissatisfaction for our CEOs, when I looked across, this was the area where this is the area of greatest dissatisfaction for CEOs. So there's not going to be a slide that shows us that CEOs are more dissatisfied about something than their other teams. This is their greatest area of dissatisfaction. They're not in line with the rest of their leaders. It's just not in step with them.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Interesting. I think on the next slide, this is that a third of directors and managers are dissatisfied with work structure. So before you get into these numbers, explain to us again and I know most people on here took the survey, what did we mean by work structure when we asked that question?
Right. So at the very beginning of the survey, we asked people how they were organized. So are you hybrid? Are you remote first? Are you in person first? And the largest chunk of our respondent pool was that hybrid workforce. Our second largest was the remote first at nearly 30%, and our in-person was at 3%. So when we asked people about their work structure, again, that was one of those 6 points of satisfaction where we asked people, are you satisfied? How satisfied are you with these following 6 areas? We just talked about employee retention. This was another area on that list. It was work structure. So overall, kind of going back a bit, work structure, people were 15% dissatisfied. Our leaders were 15% dissatisfied with work structure. So it wasn't huge, right? It's definitely less that employee retention number, about 10 points less than our employee retention number, but still sizable, because what I then looked at was, is everyone feeling the same level of dissatisfaction? And what we saw is that they aren't. So what we're looking at here is what I told you I called my dissatisfaction pie. And I'm just looking at the level of dissatisfaction. So really looking at that 15%, and is it evenly distributed? And it's not. So our C-suite and our CEO and our VPs, they're all in step. They had the same level of dissatisfaction about work structure, but our managers did not. They feel much more dissatisfied about the work structure than those C-suite leaders by over 4 times.
And I don't know that is that surprising, because I know that in the work that we do with organizations, managers and the manager effectiveness, especially managing hybrid teams, comes up a lot. And we used to joke when we came out of the pandemic, it was sort of the, the resurrection or the rise of the middle manager again, because they have a lot on their shoulders, right? I mean, they're really carrying the responsibility of corporate policies, current events, and for many people, because of diminished communication channels when you're a hybrid, they get so much through their manager. And it looks to here, I think that's sort of proving it out. And again, I think we see this in our private work, that the manager continues to be under stress in the way that we're executing hybrid and remote workforce structure.
Right. They're concerned about onboarding. They're concerned about other things, right? They're not concerned about that collaboration piece, but there's some pieces about the way that we're doing work. Maybe it's not being nearly as involved in formulating the policy that brings everyone into the office. Like we discussed before, only 16% of managers are involved in kind of making that decision of what days of the week or how time is being distributed in a hybrid workforce. So that could be just, contributing to that dissatisfaction is, not being able to bring your team in and do the things you want the way you want to. I think the big takeaway here, like we said before with that retention piece, is that it should be a window into conversation. So sit all the leaders down and have a conversation that understand if this is happening in your organization, and if so, then get to some of those root causes so that they can be addressed and they don't kind of filter out into the rest of the organization, because you want your leadership to be in step with each other. And I think what's helpful about pointing out where these differences are is that while everyone is really feeling high and happy about productivity, there are some areas where our leadership, our opinions are diverging, and that will then filter down to the rest of the organization. It always does, right?
It has been, right? I mean, we knew this when we came out of the pandemic, that there was a big discrepancy between the way employees were feeling, the way that top leadership was feeling. I think it's interesting that you're pointing out here that, it's actually it's in the management level as well. There's a big discrepancy between the C-suite and directors and managers.
Right. And I remember reading a report by Microsoft earlier this year that said, like 54% of managers think that their leaders are, unaware of what their staff wants. So I think that, again, kind of gets at a similar point.
Oh, very interesting. All right. So just a couple of closing thoughts here of some of the things that we talked about. And I think this is one of the big takeaways, again, was that organizations are not necessarily designing operationally or physically to address some of those top concerns about what people want and what they want when they come into the office. And one of the things that, I know that when I was at a remote conference the other day, and again, it was just the organizations that are being the most successful of getting people back in the office, they are at least starting to do stuff operationally and physically, as we talked about earlier, doing some sorts of changes in the space to make it more collaborative, more social, and then operationally moving to that team-led, which so far seems to be one of the most successful models to implement if you're going to have a hybrid workforce.
Right. And I think one of the things I know I've read in outside research is, initially, I think a lot of leaders were hesitant to have to deal with a hybrid workplace. And so a lot of hybrid work, as you and I know with clients, sometimes happen just because of a default position rather than making the decision. And so what we want people to do is really think about their workplace and where can we make active decisions about how we're going to do things. So we know what our concerns are. Let's do something about that, right? Rather than just saying, I'm concerned that a hybrid workplace is not going to allow for spontaneous communication. Let's take action that allows us to actually address that. Let's take action to address culture and collaboration by looking at our spaces and by thinking about how we address, how we craft those policies. So really, rather than sitting back and waiting, this is the time to act.
Yeah. And at that same conference, it's interesting that you put that up there as the act, because they were saying you just got to do something so that employees were seeing that you were working on it. And again, not to be afraid to iterate, because we don't all know where this goes. So, if budgets are tight, you might iterate with it. So you may not start with a major change physically, but you do need to do something, because your offices simply cannot look like they did before pre-pandemic in the way that people are wanting to work right now. Not doing anything isn't a course of action. So
No, it's not.
yeah.
And
And then also,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, and then the last one again, making sure that you engage. And I think, Maria, I think you're putting together another study or looking deeper into the data that there is some indication where we can show staff satisfaction and happiness, the more they are asked and the more input they have into these operational questions. So the point there being like, please engage with staff in terms of asking them what they want and how they want to design the hybrid workplace, knowing that we've got all these concerns. I think a lot of the concerns that came out in this survey are also concerns that we do hear about nationally. But there is a way to start addressing them. And if you sort of lay those concerns out about what they are and then bringing employees in to understand how to address them, and if the model we create, how many of these concerns does it address? Like, that's a good starting point.
Definitely. I think I tried to spotlight areas where I think there's natural areas for conversation, especially among leaders. But it's important for our leaders to be on the same page before everyone else. And that way that message can be consistent up and down our organizations. And then one other thing that I often hear from leaders is a concern that, well, I've already surveyed my people. They're going to be upset that I'm surveying them again or asking them again. And really staff aren't. I find that they're really willing to give you opinions about what they want with space. I've been really surprised when I've discussed space with staff, and they have very fine ideas about what they want to see in the space. They've really thought about it. They're very thoughtful ideas. Yeah. And then I think also they want to have a hand in the place that they work. They spend so much time, we spend so much time working, and they want to have a say. And as long as there is that transparency in, I've taken this survey, you've taken this survey because I want to know what the feedback is, and this is what we're doing based on what you have said. And maybe we want to do all 5 of those things because we can't, or it's not, just not able to do it, but we're going to do 1 and 2, or we're going to tackle these in this sort of a timeline. But I think it's just having those lines of communication.
Well, and I think it's interesting about being afraid of survey. What I think I find in one of our clients, only be afraid of doing surveys if you keep doing surveys and you don't do anything with the information. Yes. Because now employees are going to get tired of that. But if you're taking the time to put together the surveys, then make sure that you have some, you take action after the surveys and convey to the staff what you're going to do with them. So thank you, Maria. Appreciate it very much. I don't know if anybody's got any questions. I don't see anything in the chat. I am going to put this up here, this QR code, for those of you that are on the call. If you wouldn't mind taking a picture of this, letting us know how we did today. And again, you will be getting a copy of the slide deck as well as the executive summary. I don't know, Christine, is there anything in anonymous that you've got in there? Because I don't see anything in the chat.
I am checking one more time right now, John.
And again, of course, while she checks that, if you, Maria, we want to thank you, but then if any of you have any questions about the work that we do, or if you want to see how Achurch might be able to help you out in your workplace transformation, of course, you can see our emails are there, and you get emails back after this. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. So.
And John, we do not have anything in the anonymous questions.
Excellent. All right. Well, we can give everybody back 12 minutes of their day. So we appreciate it. Time is important and expensive. So thank you all very much again. We appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Thank you, John. Bye.
Thanks.